General, again, thank you so much for your time and for your patience with us. And I just, without wasting too much time, I want to thank you for joining us for this, because we really need your analysis to kind of try and better understand what's going on in the world now. Without further ado, I would like to move to Ukraine. I know you've been watching the developments in Kursk, and I just wanted to hear your assessment of the situation and the latest on the ground.
Well, I think it's a very significant achievement by the Ukrainian forces. This was not just a raid by Russians operating for Ukraine, as we've seen in the past in Belgorod. This is a real military operation with elements of 4 brigades, some of them quite elite brigades of Ukrainian forces, not just infantry and armor, but also air defense, artillery, electronic warfare, counter-drone, logistics to support all of it, intelligence, engineers, a combined arms team that has shown enormous proficiency. Yes, the Russians were caught completely by surprise, wholly inadequate defenses. It really shows how weak the Russian border guards, border services, and the National Guard are, much less the police. The Ukrainians have exploited this very impressively. I think that they're literally in the develop the situation mode, to use the military term, for let's exploit this to the extent that we can, make sure we don't take undue risks. They have to be very careful not to get cut off on the flanks and encircled by Russian forces that might respond. But frankly, the Russian response so far has been wholly inadequate. For some reason, Putin put the Minister of Emergency Services in charge of this instead of charging his military with doing it. Perhaps that's because he's the one who oversees some of these domestic security elements, but they're not going to be adequate to stop the Ukrainian military forces, much less actually roll them back. The report now is that there are Russian forces coming from the eastern part of the Russian Federation. That's going to take a very long time. There's no real understanding about how capable they might be, how well trained, how well led, how coherent, and so forth. Russia clearly has been reluctant to pull forces out of the other parts of the east or southeast, and indeed they are continuing to achieve incremental gains at very high cost, but nonetheless achieving incremental gains in Donetsk in particular. But this is, again, a significant achievement, not just because of the psychological impact of showing that Ukraine can go on the offensive successfully, but because they have cut the most important rail line that connects Moscow with the Russian forces in southeastern Ukraine, a huge blow to their effort to support those forces with logistics, resupply, ammunition, additional weapons systems, vehicles, and so forth. They've also pushed Russian forces out of range in many cases of that portion of Ukraine that they could engage from that area of Kursk. Of course, it's very symbolic. This is the site of the largest tank battle in history in the final years of World War II. And it's also the first time any significant invasion of Russian territory has taken place since World War II, just as Russia's invasion of Ukraine was the first time any invasion like that at all took place. So it's a real testament, I think, to the professionalism, the expertise, the operational security, again, to achieve complete surprise. They masked this as being an exercise, a training exercise to improve their readiness, and caught the Russians completely unprepared. I think it's a tribute to General Syrskyi, the overall military commander of Ukrainian forces, someone who doesn't have the high profile, the flamboyance, if you will, of his predecessor, but I have felt has been exceedingly competent. I've met with him before. I've been in Ukraine 3 times in the last 12 months, and I'll be there again in a few weeks. And I think this is a great testament to him and to his staff, noting that he was, of course, the overall commander of the Kharkiv offensive in the fall of the first year of this war that was so impressively professional in how it was conducted. Before, of course, we then saw, disappointingly, the next summer, the much vaunted summer counteroffensive not achieve what we had hoped that it would. And really, Russia has been on the offense and Ukraine on the defense ever since that offensive essentially ground to a halt after modest gains and not cutting the southern line of communication, which had been the objective. So again, very significant. I think it has changed the mood in Ukraine. You can feel a difference, actually. I think it's palpable. That it gives hope and optimism to the Ukrainian people who were resigned to their forces just being on the defense and gradually giving up ground, albeit with Russians taking huge casualties. And I think it gives, again, a degree of, I want to be cautious here, of optimism or whatever, because this is still very much early days. It's not clear whether the Ukrainians can hold this area, much less expand it further, although they have incrementally expanded it. I mean, this is over 1,000 square kilometers, so it's quite a significant achievement. And as I mentioned, the cutting of that logistical line is particularly important, and it helps to further the effort the Ukrainians are pursuing to isolate Russian forces, something they're also doing, of course, in Crimea, where they've forced the final Russian ship out of the centuries-old port of Sevastopol using aerial drones and maritime drones, with which they've sunk a third of the Russian Black Sea Fleet. That made the headquarters and the airfields there largely untenable. And they're gradually degrading the ability of Russia to use its ferries to cross the Kerch Strait. And at some point, I think you'll see the Kerch Strait Bridge come down as well. So again, all of this, I think, is a dramatic shift on the battlefield there. Actually, we were waiting for the Russian offensive this summer, and it really has not materialized, although, again, incremental gains in Donetsk that are worrisome. And the Ukrainians have to figure out how to stop those as they are ramping up their own force generation process, having changed the conscription law, which was quite a contentious issue in the Rada, the parliament, just as was the contentious issue in our House of Representatives, the additional assistance that thankfully was finally passed a very considerable amount. And in fact, today, the State Department announced yet another substantial amount of assistance for Ukraine, drawing down American stocks to do so.
General, we also heard opinions that on one hand, it might be a smart strategic move for Ukraine for whatever reasons they're envisioning for themselves. We're also hearing the opinions that it might be a dangerous gamble for Kiev. Do you see any dangers there?
Sure. As I said earlier, there are risks. There are several of them. One is the fact that these forces are in Kursk rather than in Donetsk, halting the offensive of the Russians. Another is that there is a risk, if the Russians had a competent counterattack, of being cut off in Kursk. Instead, actually, it looks as if they may cut off Russian forces that are in Kursk, having already taken the surrender of hundreds of these, if not now in the thousands. Something that's very helpful, of course, for future prisoner of war exchanges as well. And this also could be the beginning of a change in the dynamics of this war, to where all of a sudden they're taking the fight to Russia so much. Of course, this also enables them to go deeper into Russia. They had some very successful operations a few nights ago against a Russian airfield where there were a number of Russian planes that were parked, and they took out a number of those. Again, it pushes back the Russian aircraft ability to operate against that portion of the Ukrainian east border. Unfortunately, that doesn't affect their ability to continue to hammer Kharkiv, the second largest city, and of course near the border, with these very lethal glide bombs with 2,000 or 3,000 kilograms of explosive on them, and being able to launch them 50 kilometers from their targets and then glide the rest of the way. But again, I think a very important development here, but there is risk. Again, there is an opportunity cost of these forces being there instead of on the defensive front in Donetsk, and they have to be careful. I think they're very, very carefully assessing the Russian reaction, watching it materialize, determining whether they can hold it off when it does materialize, and also in the meantime continue to exploit opportunities to expand the area of Russian territory that they control with this 4-brigade size force.
General, from purely military analysis, looking at the bigger picture, we're seeing the territories captured by Ukrainian Kursk. We're seeing some advances by Russia in on the eastern flank. Can we say that one or the other side has the initiative now? Again, speaking about the bigger picture.
I think this operation changes that assessment. I think previously we would have said that the Russians had the initiative. They weren't achieving a massive amount with that, but they were the ones on the offensive, and the Ukrainians were clearly on the defensive. Now you see this operation. You also see the increasingly innovative and, in some cases, devastatingly effective use of aerial drones. I already mentioned the maritime drones. Ukraine is in the process of building 1 million drones in a 12-month period. That's the objective that they have stated publicly. And if you do the math, that means that they can send thousands of drones every day at the Russians who are attacking them. And they've created very impressive below-ground intelligence command posts where they can assess what the Russians are doing on the front line and augment the frontline forces with these various and basically drone armies now. Again, consider thousands of suicide drones. They're quite cheap, they're mass produced, but they're very effective. And they can be flown right into the hatch of a tank, a window of a building, an individual soldier, you name it. And there's plenty of videos online that show this and how devastatingly effective they are. So that's yet another dynamic here. Then we'll have to see how Ukraine does in generating additional forces. I think that's the single biggest factor right now. Now that U.S. assistance is turned back on and refilling the pipeline, never as fast as President Zelensky would like, and I would agree with that. Still some restrictions on the use of some of the longer range American capabilities on Russian territory. But by and large, that element is back. The Europeans have been very solid. Indeed, they've provided in aggregate more than the total of economic, humanitarian, and security assistance that the U.S. has provided. And I believe they're actually neck and neck with the U.S. when it comes to security. So all of these other factors, again, solid or on an upswing, as is the case with the U.S. provided assistance. The one that is being watched most closely now, I think that we should watch, is the Ukrainian ability to bring new young men into their forces, train and equip them, put them into organizations or use them as individual replacements, and increase the capabilities of the Ukrainians on the front lines, and also in the use of various technologies that they have capitalized on so impressively. Another area is electronic warfare. I know the startups actually they're beyond startups now. They're real military industrial complexes. When you create 1 million EW domes, and a dome can be everything from a jammer that's carried in a soldier's rucksack, only lasts as long as the battery, obviously, or on a vehicle, on a weapon system, a headquarters, a compound. You need many of them, of course. So you see that as well. So these are all the different factors that will determine the momentum on the battlefield, the success by relative sides on the battlefield. Ukraine has an awful lot of impressive qualities, but you then have to recognize that they're fighting an enemy. However inept the leader has been, this grievance-filled, kleptocratic, revanchist and revisionist president of Russia, nonetheless, if you have a 4 or 5 to 1 advantage in manpower and a 10 to 15 to 1 advantage in economy, that's a tough adversary. Even if they're not as agile, even if they're not as perhaps as motivated. After all, Ukraine is fighting for its very independence, and all Ukrainians know that. But again, these are the factors, I think, that will determine which side gains in the weeks and months that lie ahead. But right now, watch Ukrainian force generation, watch the situation in Donetsk, and watch how Russia responds to this incursion into Kursk.
General, it's been suggested that for Putin, it was more important to advance in Donbass rather than to quickly redeploy troops to handle the situation in Kursk. And there are also multiple speculations about the crisis of kind of a management style of Putin overall. And we're seeing the sequence of events. We just witnessed the hostage situation in the penal colony, which was in itself allegedly was a response to the response of the Russian authorities to the Crocus City Hall terrorist attack. And it does seem to be suggesting that there is a crisis management, lack of crisis management, or problems with crisis management on the higher level in Russia. How bad do you think it is, and is this trend reversible?
I suspect it's not bad enough, unfortunately. But certainly there have been challenges. We had the Prigozhin challenge. We've had others that we've seen. There's been fierce criticism of Putin by even some of the ultra right wing who feel that he's not being firm enough, not decisive enough, and so forth. And he has not been decisive. As I mentioned, this response has been pretty incoherent so far, certainly ineffective, and not all that sensible, frankly, from my perspective. You can argue, indeed, I think it's correct to assess that it's more important to the Russian military to continue the effort in Donetsk, where they have been achieving gains, in some cases a couple of kilometers a day claimed in some of these areas. And again, it's incumbent on the Ukrainians to figure out how to stop them. But he's got problems, without question. Unfortunately, I just don't think they're sufficiently serious. And he has the reins of power in his hand. There's no consolidated opponent who could do something about that. The various security forces that might be the ones that could undertake some kind of coup are all separate, plays them off against each other. He certainly doesn't have a succession plan. So I think, unfortunately, he is still pretty solidly in the saddle. But never say never. This is one of those cases where historians have always said, it was inconceivable that this individual could be toppled, and then once he was, they said it was inevitable. And I hope the latter proves true rather than the former, but I'm not confident in that assessment.
One more question with regards to that. We heard the assessments that with the incursion into Kursk, the red lines of President Putin has been crossed, and yet nothing happened. There was no meaningful response, meaningful quote unquote, which led to some voices advocating that these red lines should be explored further. The crossing of the red lines should be explored further, in part with possibly strikes into the Russian territory by Ukraine. And here, I'm just wondering about your assessment of this whole red line rhetoric and the situation. Should we conclude at this point that the red lines of President Putin are kind of exponentially stretchable?
Oh, absolutely. I think that these supposed red lines have always been some form of nuclear saber rattling that Putin long since concluded would just not be sensible. Keep in mind that Prime Minister Modi of India and President Xi of China, the latter being his partner without limits, supposedly, publicly cautioned Putin against even considering the use of nuclear weapons. And certainly it's not going to do it for something like we have seen so far. There may be a red line out there somewhere, but I don't think we have really approached it. And I felt that we have long been far too cautious in that regard. You noted the possibility of Ukrainian strikes in Russian territory. They've been doing that every single night, sometimes with dozens and dozens of drones and missiles and so forth. And why we are restricting some of our most effective munitions at this point is not something that makes sense to me. And again, as I noted, I think the U.S. response, the Western response to Russia's invasion has been very, very impressive. It has been quite coherent. Everyone has been working together. They've avoided Putin driving wedges between East and West Europe. There's some outliers, Hungary and so forth, but he hasn't been a veto against some of these different initiatives to support Ukraine. European countries have very much stepped up in terms of their spending on defense. A record number of the 32 members of NATO now spend over 2% of GDP on defense. The Europeans in aggregate providing more than the Americans, which is appropriate, frankly. Again, they're a lot closer to this problem than we are. We have global responsibilities as well, from which they benefit, are assuming those responsibilities. But why we have hesitated along the way, again, has not been something that I can fully understand. The delay over providing M1 tanks delayed the provision of the German Leopards, meant that the Ukrainians didn't have all that they should have had last summer for their counteroffensive. The delay on decision on F-16s. There's no alternative to F-16. Actually, there is, but it's a Swedish Gripen. There's just not enough of them out there. It actually would be a better aircraft. It's more rugged. It can operate on airfields that aren't as pristine as the F-16 generally needs. But the F-16 is the ubiquitous aircraft in NATO countries, and that's the one that you can get the most of to them. And why we delayed the training and then the approval of transfer of those aircraft, again, just stretched way beyond my understanding. It just did not seem sensible to me. The same with the provision of the Army Tactical Missile System, some of the earlier multiple launch rocket system munitions, other decisions on sophisticated, and then again, as I mentioned, the restrictions on the use of some of these systems on Russian soil. I think we've long since should have recognized that this is essentially self-deterrence that just no longer makes sense. And I hope that we will remove the final restrictions that we have and also identify additional capabilities that we can provide to Ukraine, be willing to take a bit more risk with some of the other ways in which we're able to help Ukraine as they are striving to maintain their very independence.
General, Kursk operation was said to be an attempt by Kyiv to possibly get on kind of better negotiating positions if there were ever negotiations, which now looks slightly, far away in time. And I would like to dig deeper here in the role of diplomacy in this conflict. You recently quoted your colleague, General Jim Mattis, and the quote is, "If you don't give us diplomats, you have to provide us more ammunition." And that's exactly what you're describing. It's been ammunition by the allies provided by allies flowing to Ukraine. Do you think there was no room for diplomacy or no appetite for it?
I think it's probably both. There's appetite for it. President Zelensky has put forward his peace plan. There's no way that Putin would ever accept all of these conditions, which, the removal of all Russian forces, reparations, international legal action, all of this, again, it's a good opening position. But frankly, the quote about diplomats was really more about the wars in which I was privileged to command, in fact, Iraq and Afghanistan, which General Mattis was also engaged at various levels as well. And in those cases, we needed the diplomats, we needed the development experts, we needed the intelligence officers, we needed the rule of law experts, all of these, because we were engaged in very substantial nation building, which was unavoidable, by the way. Those that say we never should have gotten engaged in that need to tell me how it is that we hand off the tasks that we're performing in those countries if there are no counterparts to do that. So we had to build up host nation security forces in Iraq and Afghanistan and in other locations. We had to build up critical institutions. And for that, you need the experts on that, which our military often are not. In this case, there's really not much of an appetite on either side for negotiations. Putin still thinks that the Russian forces are advancing on the battlefield. He's not satisfied with what they have achieved, certainly so far. President Zelensky can't countenance giving up the territory that Russians occupy. At some point, they may do some of that, but that time is not here. But certainly what I was always hoping is that you could see, again, a change in the dynamics of the battlefield. That's what I referred to earlier. And Kursk can contribute to that. Had Ukraine last summer been able to penetrate the defenses in the south and through Zaporizhia and get all the way to the coast and cut the line of communications that it connects Russia proper into northern Crimea and the forces that would then be west of the Ukrainian element that cuts the Russian forces, that might have changed the dynamic. It's possible that what they're doing in Crimea changes the dynamic. Forcing the Russian Black Sea Fleet out of the Western Black Sea definitely changes the dynamic, and it also allows the Ukrainian merchant fleet to export grain and so forth from Ukraine. That's important for Ukraine's fiscal bottom line. It's also important for food security for countries such as Egypt and others in North Africa. So again, all of these are elements of this overall context in which this war is being fought. And if you get enough of those on one side in particular, you might be able to change the dynamic and eventually convince Vladimir Putin he's not going to get any more. In fact, if he continues, he might lose. And then perhaps there might be an appetite for some kind of meaningful discussion. But I don't want to get into, should you give up this or that to get the guns to go silent? There's a lot of considerations there, the most important ones of which, in my view, are not actually geographic. It's actually more the security guarantee that would be provided to Ukraine, which would have to be ironclad, and also then Ukrainian accession to the EU and real economic opportunities for them as well.
We're watching the developments of the UN expressing their concerns over the situation close to Kursk and Zaporizhia nuclear stations, and we're hearing different assessments of drones flying dangerously close, drones, falling down close to the stations. And it feels like it takes me back to kind of the idea of these red lines. This whole nuclear component in this military conflict has been spoken about, but not necessarily addressed by the international community. And there are concerns, but there are no red lines that the international community is kind of drawing around this subject. Is it not feasible in this kind of scale, with this scale of the military conflict? And are we watching a disaster in the making here?
I don't think so. I think what you see is Russian misinformation and disinformation and potentially a false flag operation where they're going to do something, they're planning it, and they're going to want to blame it on Ukraine and create some situation in which they can be outraged and perhaps take this to the Court of International Opinion or what have you. They've done this a bit before with the Zaporizhia nuclear plant they're occupying in Ukraine, and that appears to be what they're doing in the nuclear plant that is near the incursion in this case. So again, I think this is Russia just once again trying to be threatening, trying to create worries and angst in the West and in the world. But I don't see any way that Ukraine is going to do anything to a nuclear power plant on Russia's soil, much less on Ukrainian soil. They have firsthand experience of what happens with a nuclear power plant if it melts down, as you well know.
As a military general, you wouldn't be, say you were commanding this operation, for instance, you wouldn't be concerned with the possibility of a missed, of a strike that is not necessarily targeted, but just happens to land on one of those nuclear stations?
No, I'd be very concerned about it, and I'd make sure that you mitigate the risks of it. And I'd also be very concerned about a Russian false flag operation and be warning the world about that as well. And they are doing that.
General, you wrote a fascinating book, and it looks into the kind of evolution of military of the warfare from the World War II to Ukraine, essentially. And you're making an interesting point that with the war in Ukraine, we're seeing kind of this deja vu of being sent back to almost the situation of the World War I, where certain tactics are used at the same time at the backdrop of the proliferation of unmanned armed systems that are changing the nature of the conflict, and you just mentioned drones. Just looking at all that, what does it tell us about the future of warfare?
That it is changing, and it's changing very rapidly on the Ukrainian battlefield. But you're right that this is a war that has elements of World War I. The tanks and infantry fighting vehicles are very similar, reminiscent, or the same as those that faced off across the inter-German border when I was a young Army major and the operations officer for a mechanized battalion and then a mechanized brigade very near the inter-German border. And we essentially had, there were Leopards on the German side, there were the M1 tanks on the US, there were T-62s, T-64s, T-72s, the start of T-80s. All of these are on this battlefield as well. But then you have some very cutting edge systems, and you also have a context that is truly unique. Never before has there been a war in which so many people on the battlefield have smartphones and the ability to take pictures and videos and so on, ubiquitous access to the internet, and social media platforms onto which they can upload these videos and photos and commentary and so on. So that creates a degree of transparency. The open source intelligence, as this is termed, is incredibly rich. And if you use data aggregators and a variety of other means and assiduously mine this, assiduously look at this, and I do, you can almost feel this war from afar without access to highly classified information in a way that I could feel the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, but with the aid of highly classified information. Max Boot, the great Washington Post columnist and very astute military observer, has described the war in Ukraine as one in which all quiet on the Western Front, a reference to the World War I, of course, meets Blade Runner, a reference to futuristic technologies. And you saw that last summer, where you had these multiple belts of defenses. The Surovikin line, named for General Surovikin, oversaw the construction of those defenses by the Russians. Miles deep minefields, no man's lands, essentially, trenches, overhead cover, underground bunkers, barbed wire, concertina wire, even gas. It was, yes, tear gas, not nerve gas, and heavy, very heavy artillery, lots of artillery units. But that, reminiscent of World War I, right on top of those defenses, on top of the minefields in particular, were drones that would identify the Ukrainian forces trying to breach those minefields and other obstacles, digitally linked to the fire direction center of the Russian artillery battalions, who then put the data right on the guns and have very accurate, very responsive fire. And you're seeing now, even more recently, again, this armada of unmanned aerial systems used by Ukraine in particular, although both sides are using them. The Russians are getting the Iranian Shahed drones. And now we're about to see the introduction of robotic dogs on the battlefield on the Ukrainian side that are going to be very effective, just as have been their maritime drones, which in many cases are made from cheap material, readily available technology, but very, very effective, again, in sinking 1/3 of the Russian Black Sea fleet and forcing them to clear out of the entire part of the Western Black Sea. And I think at sometime they're going to expand the range of those. They're already going after the ferries again that connect Kerch with Russia proper, across the Kerch Strait, Crimea with Russia proper. And then they're also going to go, I think, at some point in time at the Russian ports that are on the eastern Black Sea, once they can increase the range of their unmanned systems. So this is, again, this is the future of war. We advocate in the book, Andrew Roberts, Lord Roberts of Belgravia, and I do, that it needs to be a transition of some of our force structure, not all, but a good amount, from a small number of large platforms to a massive number of small platforms. The large platforms being very heavily manned, incredibly expensive, exquisitely capable, but increasingly vulnerable, as we have seen with the ships of the Russian Black Sea. Now, our ships are much better defended. There's much more technology and capability. But at some point in time, those large platforms are going to be much less viable than they are now. And you need to shift to what Ukraine has and what has enabled them, again, by and large, to hold the Russian achievements to fairly modest gains by throwing drones at the Russians when they don't have enough men on the front lines. So this is by necessity. And 1 million drones in a 12-month period is just an extraordinary objective, and I think they'll come close to meeting it. And what that enables them to do on a daily basis is very, very considerable, especially given that they have to be very concerned about casualties in a way that the Russians just are not.
You have talked about the advanced systems in different Ukrainian innovation, but we also know that the innovation has been supplied to Ukraine from allies in many different shapes and forms. Is it safe to conclude that Ukraine actually was, as it was suggested on multiple occasions, was used as a test bed for Western military technologies and innovation? Would you agree with that statement?
Only to a degree, actually, because some of our most accurate, most expensive, most accurate systems have been rendered inaccurate by Russian electronic warfare. And whereas the Ukrainians are changing the software on a weekly basis to compensate for what the Russians are doing, they're particularly good with electronic warfare. Our production cycles and systems are much less agile and responsive. And so we need to accelerate that. It's interesting that in the US, you're starting to see the development of startups that are designed to do what the Russian or the Ukrainian startups in Ukraine are doing, which is to very rapidly prototype and then manufacture cheap unmanned systems of all types. This includes also intelligence, reconnaissance, and surveillance, not just those in the air, but in a variety of other different mediums. I was just recently at a lab of one of these that featured a lot of these different, that is evaluating a lot of these new products, and they're really impressive. But we've got to accelerate the development of those. And it's a very different model from what our major defense contractors do in the United States, which is largely to produce very substantial fighters, bombers, tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, aircraft carriers, major surface combatants, to produce, again, instead of small numbers of those, just incalculable numbers of, again, unmanned systems that increasingly will not be remotely piloted by humans. They're going to be algorithmically piloted. And who's actually doing that on the battlefield in Ukraine? It's not necessarily systems that we're providing. We're starting to do that. We're starting to prototype and to experiment with that. There's always technology transfer issues as well that are a bugaboo of what it is we try to do. There's, the cutting edge counter drone systems that we have in the US are still quite early stage. Sum up this particular segment by noting how significant the developments on the battlefield in Ukraine are for the future of warfare. The focus has tended to be on aerial drones of certain types, but there's many, many different types of aerial drones. Now we're going to see, again, robots on the ground, again, dogs that are incredibly capable, can carry out a variety of functions. We've talked about the maritime drones. So this is going to transform how wars are fought. And increasingly, it's going to be machine on machine. Yes, there will be humans on the loop, in the background, perhaps behind the front lines or what have you. And certainly all of the ubiquitous intelligence capabilities are evolving quite rapidly as well. There are a number of public stories about how the Ukrainians are manning these command posts, which can identify through the systems that they have capable and to which they're provided access from supportive collaborators, intelligence about what the Russians are doing as they are doing it, sometimes in advance of them actually doing it. And then they guide, coordinate, synchronize the responses, not just with soldiers on the ground, but again, with all of these different unmanned systems that they can bring to bear on the enemy.
What is your assessment of the Russian military intelligence, to your knowledge?
Well, it obviously failed to pick up a very substantial invasion of their own territory. 4 brigades can't be assembled. We didn't think that you could assemble elements of 4 brigades and all of the supporting arms and logistics without that being noticed. I don't think, for example, the Russians can do that on Ukrainian soil or even close to their border. So that is not a particularly encouraging assessment of what they have, if you're looking at it from a Russian perspective, certainly. And their intelligence has often proved very flawed, as it did when they completely underestimated the capability of Ukrainian forces at the outset of the invasion, overestimated their own capabilities, and also demonstrated a number of other significant flaws, everything from soldiers' individual tasks, discipline, lack thereof, actually command and control systems, campaign design, logistics support, and all the rest of that. But basically, very unimpressive strategic decision making as well. But again, we then return to the reality that Ukraine is very heavily outnumbered, and they're even at a greater disadvantage when it comes to the comparison of the two economies. So you've got to make up for that with a variety of different innovations, and Ukraine is doing that very impressively, but not yet so impressively that they're able to roll the Russians back on their own territory just yet.
General, just briefly talking about the U.S. assessment of the incursion, we heard from Pentagon that there are still questions about the goals and objectives of the Ukrainian armed forces in Kursk region after the explanation that Kyiv gave, Pentagon officials said. If the U.S. has been taken by surprise with this military operation, what does it tell us about the level of coordination between the allies? And actually, do we even expect such coordination at this point?
Well, I think that we have always had allies, and there are others in the world right now that we're supporting who have decided, you know what, maybe we shouldn't discuss this with the Americans. They might not want to know about it, on the one hand, in some instances, not necessarily in this one. And then in others, they might try to discourage us from doing it. It's well known that there was disagreement between the Americans and the Ukrainians on the summer counteroffensive last year. And I don't know that the battlefield results validated one side or the other, frankly. Clearly, the execution, the design and execution, and just really the capabilities that were present proved inadequate. But it's not uncommon for allies to have differing views. Look, in the wars that I was privileged to command, keep in mind I had 5 combat commands as a general officer. Our allies didn't always see it the same way that we did. And occasionally, again, you conduct certain operations. The number of individuals briefed on the Osama bin Laden raid, for example, was very, very limited. So I don't think this is uncharacteristic of war. And I do know, in fact, that the number of individuals who actually were read in on this operation was very, very small. General Syrskyi did his meetings with President Zelensky with no one else in the room. So not only did they not consult with or fully inform Ukraine's American partners, they didn't even fully inform the office of the president of Ukraine. And that was similar to the operation that was conducted again to get Osama bin Laden. Of course, I was the commander in Afghanistan at that time. And even I was brought into it fairly late in the game because it was a special operation that was overseen by the CIA and outside of my theater, even though it was conducted from territory that I oversaw.
General, I'm going to throw in a bit of a provocation since we're talking about Afghanistan. And in various conversations here in the United States and across the Atlantic, I've been hearing that from the military PR point of view, Ukraine was kind of a compensation for how the Afghanistan withdrawal happened, and that the U.S. went into supporting Ukraine so steadily and so steadfastly because there needed to be done something about the kind of image that the U.S. got after the Afghanistan withdrawal.
It could be a factor, but I think the most important factor is that you had a country that largely shares our values, democracy, free market, capitalist economy, invaded by a country that does not and is the common enemy of all of NATO. And the U.S. is the leader of NATO by far. Keep in mind, the U.S. doesn't just spend more than all of our NATO allies put together. We spend more than 2 times as much as all of them. And our president is committed to NATO, has been for decades, and felt absolutely compelled to do this. What I will say is that I do believe it is accurate to say that the decision to withdraw from Afghanistan, which I thought was, I disagreed with fundamentally. I stated that publicly, especially because it was really quite foreseeable that the Afghan security forces would eventually collapse. We forced the Afghans to give 5,500 detainees back to the Taliban, which enabled them to carry out this simultaneous offensive. And then we withdrew not just our forces, but then all the allied forces left. And then we had to pull the contractors out who actually maintained 17,000 contractors who maintained the overly sophisticated U.S. helicopters that we insisted on providing to them. Not while I was the commander. I fought against this. I wanted to keep getting the old Soviet refurbished and Russians analog systems that the Afghans could actually repair and maintain themselves. But the moment our contractors left, the degradation of operational readiness of aircraft that were being thrown into combat, enormous commitments getting shot up and could not be kept flyable. And once the soldiers know that there's no commandos coming to the rescue, remember the whole linchpin of their defense system is that you have 35,000 really capable, well-trained, motivated commandos who are deployed out to reinforce the very modestly trained and equipped soldiers in the outlying areas and the police out there. And that's the whole concept. There's no other concept possible for that country. But once that air mobility is dramatically reduced and there are multiple attacks ongoing around the country and you don't respond, the troops who had fought admirably prior to that, dozens of times more casualties than we took. Keep in mind, we hadn't even lost a soldier in the final 18 months. And I felt that that diplomatic agreement that we reached was the worst in our modern diplomatic history. And that was taken by the previous administration, of course. But then this administration, which reversed many of the previous administration's international actions, returned to the World Health Organization, returned to the Paris Climate Accord, a variety of other international actions, felt that they had to go through with this, which again was inexplicable to me. I said that we would come to regret it. I believe that we certainly should have, at this point in time, seen what has transpired in Afghanistan, where we've condemned a country that we sought to support for 20 years. However disappointing some of the results of that may have been, however maddening our counterparts and Afghan leaders may have been at times, but knowing that this would return the country to an 8th or 9th century interpretation of ultra-conservative Islam, result in women not being able to go to high school, much less college, not able to do much outside the house to contribute, and on and on. And, you know, the country that's basically, its economy has collapsed, they're starving, and millions of Afghans have voted with their feet. Millions more would if they were able to. So I think it was a disastrous decision and a disastrous outcome, and frankly, disastrous execution. And I think that undermined deterrence. Putin looked at that and said, heck, if they're not going to support that country, why are they going to support Ukraine, which is not part of NATO? And it probably undermined deterrence in the Indo-Pacific. And so there was a consciousness of that, I think. And I think a factor perhaps in we needed to show our leadership in the world, because deterrence rests on a potential adversary's assessment of your capabilities on the one hand and your willingness to employ them on the other. And this implied a willingness not to use what it is that we had. Again, we only had 3,500 troops on the ground. We were no longer on the front lines. We were doing what's called advise, assist, and enable operations. We hadn't lost a soldier in combat in 18 months. The cost was minimal out of an $800 billion defense budget, $25 billion. And it was quite predictable what was going to happen. And yet we went forward with it. So I think it was a huge mistake. I think there were reverberations of that elsewhere, including probably in the Kremlin, and certainly in the Indo-Pacific, where President Xi said, see, can't count on the Americans. They're not a reliable ally or partner. And look how it went. They're a great power in decline. Now, I don't believe either of those, but it may well be that there were some folks in the White House who said, boy, we need to show that we are a reliable partner. But the big impetus here really was about responding very, very quickly and very robustly to the first invasion of a sovereign country in European territory since the end of World War II. That could not be allowed to stand.
So it sounds like there were a combination of factors, but
there are many factors. There's always, I think, a combination. You know, you seldom have a single factor equation. It's always multilateral, multifactorial, if you will. But it may have been one of the factors, but I don't think the determining factor. It wasn't the factor that had the biggest coefficient in front of it.